I'm Jasmine Marslong, and I've been working as a taxidermist for the past 13 years. I currently work for museums and galleries, and I create private commissions for homes, as well as creating my own work as an artist. I also teach taxidermy from my studio in Hastings. When I started in 2007, I wanted to set myself apart from the usual stereotypes of a taxidermist. It frightened me that I might be labelled as an animal killer. Hunting culture, collecting, colonialism and power are tightly bound within the history of taxidermy, whereas I simply wanted to preserve the beauty of animals that I had found dead by the side of the road. I wanted to make it clear to the outside world I was only going to make work using animals that had died from natural causes, and so I called myself an ethical taxidermist, so that people might question what is an ethical taxidermist. At the time, I couldn't find anyone else using that term, but today it is widely used in the taxidermy community. I spend a lot of my time educating about taxidermy and the intricacies of this truly dedicated craft. I do this as an attempt to distance myself from the stigma that some of my predecessors have given my craft, not to mention how the media portray the industry, as let's be honest, a taxidermist makes for a brilliant villain. As well as creating new taxidermy, I also work with existing museum collections, doing restoration and conservation. And although these historic collections are mostly made up of animals that will have been killed by a collector or sometimes the taxidermist, I believe it is incredibly important to care for these invaluable objects. Some look upon natural history collections with disgust and therefore dismiss them. But during the time these objects were collected and created, it was not solely for entertainment, but for educational and scientific reasons as well. In the 18th and 19th century, we did not have cameras to document the natural world in the way that we have today, and taxidermy was the only way to see animals up close from all over the world. And these objects still exist within museum collections some hundreds of years later. It takes years to become a skilled taxidermist. And to be accomplished, you must have a love and admiration of nature to have the patience to study and imitate it. Although I understand it's hard to get your head around the fact that a collector would have killed a rare bird because they actually loved that creature. I live in St Leonards-on-Sea, only a few minutes' walk from a historical blue plaque commemorating the life of an alleged conman, a taxidermist named George Bristow, that became nationally famous for the biggest taxidermy scandal the country has ever seen, the Hastings Rarities Affair. George Bristow was born in 1863 and worked as a taxidermist and gunsmith on Silchester Road in St Leonards. Ironically, Bristow is, to my knowledge, the only British taxidermist with a commemorative blue plaque, which shows his significance to the history of the craft. Bristow was wrapped up in the Hastings Rarities Affair because in 1962, which was actually 15 years after his death, the journal British Birds published two articles where authors Max Nicholson and James Ferguson Lees set out to prove that there had been a deliberate deception in the recording of rare birds that had been spotted, shot and collected in and around the Hastings area between 1903 and 1916. They claimed the sightings were statistically highly unlikely, and therefore the listings were struck off the British bird list. However, it's worth pointing out that it is possible the recordings were indeed genuine, as many of the species deleted from the records have since been seen in the area, and you could even say that Hastings seems to be a hotspot for scarce migrant birds. For example, in 2016, the first ever red-footed booby to be recorded in the UK was washed up on St Leonards Beach. Norman, which he was named, was nursed back to good health at the RSPCA's Mallydams Wood Wildlife Centre before he was flown by British Airways 5,000 miles back to his home in the Cayman Islands. But in 1962, when Nicholson and Ferguson Lee's articles were published, they held a press conference about the scandal, and the press loved it. Even though the authors stated they did not wish to prosecute or blame anyone in particular for the fraud, and warned against an investigation to place guilt on any person, alive or dead, the press wanted to hold someone responsible for this brilliant story. And this is when George Bristow comes into the spotlight. As Hastings' local taxidermist, he was given the job of mounting many of these exotic specimens into taxidermy. But Bristow was no longer alive when the story surfaced, and so could not defend himself against the tabloids. The press concluded that somehow Bristow had received frozen specimens sent over on ships, which, in my opinion, is unlikely, due to the time of which the scandal happened. Most skins at that time were sent overseas, salted and dried to be eventually rehydrated by a taxidermist, and Bristow had shown his freshly killed rare birds to specialists to mark their authenticity. There were also many birds on the list that were not collected by Bristow himself or mounted into taxidermy by Bristow, and some of the rare birds were also simply spotted and not shot by collectors, but these were also struck off the list. The case against Bristow is not proven, and it has significant unanswered questions that are still debated today. Compared to other taxidermists of his day, Bristow did not charge high prices for his work, which you would assume he might do as the fraudster he'd been painted as by the press. I personally believe he was simply a taxidermist like all the others during his time, a tradesman trying to make a living, and a bird watcher spending many hours in the countryside around Hastings waiting to catch a rare species. 100 years later, I also work with rare birds, such as this Sora rail which was found dead on Exminster Marsh in 2016. This little bird was the second ever to be spotted in Devon, and one of only 20 ever to be recorded in the UK. The Royal Albert Memorial Museum commissioned me to mount the bird into taxidermy, and now it's one of only 4 taxidermy specimens of its species within the UK's museum collections. I always try to represent the delicate sides of taxidermy. I express the sensitivity and beauty of my craft to lift the stigma, but essentially I'm doing the same job, but in a different time as George Bristow. My ethics may be different to his, but my materials and processes are still the same over 100 years later. You can see some of George Bristow's taxidermy birds on display in Hastings Museum, as well as a collection of birds from the Hastings Rarities Affair on display. The museum has wonderful wildlife dioramas and beautiful stained glass windows. Once it's safe to visit again, do go along and have a look.